Good morning, everybody. I'm very thankful to see you all this morning. I'm thankful to welcome you to what appears to be the beginning of the end of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, as shameful as that is. I don't think it's coincidental, you know how I think, but it's after 40 days of wandering in the wilderness and making the American people suffer needlessly, some Senate Democrats finally have stepped forward to end the pain. It appears to us this morning that our long national nightmare is finally coming to an end, and we're grateful for that.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to 45th Perspective. If you're new here, thank you for stopping by. And if you've been with us for a while, you already know what we do. We take the noise from Washington, strip away the spin, and talk about what's really going on beneath the headlines. Today, we're reacting to and breaking down the recent Senate hearing that centered around the end of the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. It was an emotional, at times heated, session that revealed a lot about how both parties think about power, responsibility, and the American people. Before we dive into the details, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and help us keep producing thoughtful, independent commentary by supporting the show over at patreon.com/45thperspective. For as little as $5 a month, you'll be helping us bring balanced analysis and honest discussion to a space that desperately needs it. All right,
At least some Democrats now finally appear ready to do what Republicans and President Trump and millions of hardworking American people have been asking them to do for weeks. As we said from the beginning, the people's government cannot be held hostage to further anyone's political agenda. That was never right. And shutting down the government never produces anything. It never has, if you study history. And so here we are. I want to remind everybody this morning of another critical point that you've heard me here repeat over and over the last several weeks. It's something that I and Leader John Thune and President Trump and every Republican leader have all said repeatedly from the beginning. We have always been open to finding solutions to reduce the oppressive costs of health care under the Unaffordable Care Act. We just made clear that we would not and should not ever do that, that is, negotiate as hostages. And I've also reminded you here every morning at this press conference throughout the shutdown, Republicans have not just been talking about reducing costs and fraud and abuse in so many areas and in health care. We've been actually passing new laws to accomplish that urgent mission for the people, and we will continue to do so. So here's where we are by way of schedule, just so you know, you're following. And if you're not at home, if you're waking up to this good news this morning, the Senate's vote late last night of 60-40 opens the door now. The Senate is moving forward on an amended House CR, a continuing resolution, that will reopen the government until January 30th. Added to that are provisions to fully fund SNAP provisions through the end of the next fiscal year, which is September 2026. Guaranteed back pay for all federal workers who have been made to endure these hardships over the last several weeks. And it also includes passage of 3 appropriations bills, which we're grateful to be moving through the process. That is the Military Construction Veterans Affairs bill, it's the Agriculture bill, and the Legislative Branch bill. The Senate will be back in session this morning to finish their job, and we're certainly praying that they do. They'll need unanimous consent from all senators to fast-track their final vote. As you know, there are some procedural hurdles that one or more could throw in the way, but we certainly hope that they won't do that because so many people across this country are desperate for the government to reopen. At the very moment that they do that final vote, I will call all House members to return to Washington as quickly as possible. We'll give a 36-hour formal and official notice so that we can vote as soon as possible to pass the amended CR bill and get it to the president's desk. As you all know, and he said as recently as last night, I was with him, and he told the press, he said, we want to get the government open. He's very anxious to get the government reopened and to end the Schumer shutdown. We all are. With regard to the travel challenges, I spoke yesterday at some length with Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, my former colleague and good friend, and he lamented the serious situation that we have with air travel in the U.S. He's bent over backwards, as all members of the administration and the cabinet have done in all of their areas of jurisdiction, to try to keep the government working for the people and to mitigate the pain and the harm. But the problem we have with air travel is that our air traffic controllers are overworked and unpaid, and many of them have called in sick. That's a very stressful job, and even more stressful exponentially when they're having trouble providing for their families. And so air travel has been grinding to a halt in many places. And as of Sunday, nearly half of all domestic flights and U.S. flights were either canceled or delayed. And it's a very serious situation. So I'm saying that by way of reminder. I'm stating the obvious to all my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats in the House. You need to begin right now returning to the Hill. We have to do this as quickly as possible. Now, we look forward to the government reopening this week so Congress can get back to our regular legislative session. We have a lot of business to do, as you all know, and we will be working in earnest. There'll be long days and long nights here for the foreseeable future to make up for all this lost time that was imposed upon us. I want to close with something that's important. I think it's important to say that this is genuine. I mean this sincerely. We applaud the 7 Senate Democrats and 1 independent senator who did the right thing. They decided to put principle over their personal politics. And my urgent plea of all my colleagues in the House, and that means every Democrat in the House, is to think carefully, pray, and finally do the right thing and help us to bring an end to the pain of the American people. This has gone on too long. Too many people have suffered, and it's long overdue. That's the update I wanted to give you this morning. There are probably lots of questions, but I'm going to get a lot of my own questions answered later today, so stay tuned for more. Thanks so much.
Let's get into it. This Senate hearing was held after 40 days of a government shutdown that left hundreds of thousands of federal employees without pay, halted countless public services, and put enormous strain on families and local economies across the country. The mood in Washington was tense. After weeks of partisan stalemate, the hearing marked a turning point. Senate Democrats and Republicans finally seemed to be inching toward a deal that would reopen the government. The opening statements were filled with frustration, relief, and political posturing, depending on who was speaking. On one side, Republicans framed the situation as the product of Democratic obstruction. They argued that Democrats had held the government hostage to score political points against President Trump, and that it was ordinary Americans, federal workers, small business owners, and travelers who paid the price. On the other side, Democrats insisted the shutdown was avoidable from the start. They accused the president and Republican leadership of forcing an unnecessary standoff by refusing to compromise on spending priorities. The word hostage came up a lot, each side accusing the other of using the government, and by extension the people, as leverage in a political fight. What made this hearing particularly interesting wasn't just the policy debate. It was the tone. After more than a month of bitter exchanges, there was a noticeable shift toward urgency and exhaustion. Lawmakers on both sides seemed to realize that the shutdown had gone too far. People were missing mortgage payments, small businesses were collapsing, and the pressure was mounting. The air traffic delays alone, caused by overworked and unpaid controllers, had turned into a symbol of how fragile the system becomes when politics takes priority over governance. The Speaker, one of the leading voices in the hearing, laid out a roadmap for how the Senate planned to move forward. He explained that the Senate had voted 60-40 to open the door to an amended continuing resolution, which would temporarily fund the government until January 30th. This resolution included full funding for the SNAP food assistance program through September 2026, guaranteed back pay for federal employees, and funding for 3 major appropriations bills: military construction and veterans affairs, agriculture, and the legislative branch. Now, from a legislative perspective, that's a pretty standard compromise. It keeps the government running while allowing Congress to hash out bigger disagreements later. But politically, it was a significant moment. It allowed both parties to claim some level of victory. Republicans could say they stood firm on principle, while Democrats could say they pushed for relief for workers and low-income families. As an observer, one thing that stood out to me was how each side framed the concept of responsibility. Republicans emphasized responsibility to the taxpayer, arguing that government waste, especially in healthcare and bureaucracy, had to be addressed. Democrats emphasized responsibility to the worker, arguing that no government should ever shut down over a political disagreement. These are two fundamentally different interpretations of what public service means. The Republican speaker in the hearing reminded the press that their party had continued to work on lowering healthcare costs, even during the shutdown. He cited efforts to reduce fraud and abuse within the system and emphasized that they would never negotiate as hostages. That phrase, negotiate as hostages, became something of a mantra. It reflected the view that giving in during a shutdown sets a dangerous precedent, encouraging future brinkmanship. But on the other side, Democrats argued that refusing to negotiate at all was just as dangerous. They said it showed a lack of flexibility and compassion, especially when hundreds of thousands of families were depending on government paychecks to make ends meet. The longer the shutdown dragged on, the more it became less about policy and more about pride. And that's what this hearing tried to confront. It's easy to get lost in the partisan back and forth, but when you step back, you see a broader pattern that goes beyond one administration or one party. Government shutdowns have become a recurring feature of American politics, used as tools of leverage rather than acts of last resort. What that says about the state of governance is deeply concerning. It's not just about money. It's about trust between lawmakers and trust between the government and its people. When people start feeling like their livelihoods are bargaining chips, it erodes that trust. And once trust erodes, every debate, whether it's about healthcare, immigration, or defense, starts to feel like a zero-sum fight where compromise equals defeat. That's dangerous for democracy. What the Senate hearing made clear is that both parties are aware of the cost of these shutdowns, but neither seems willing to fully change the playbook. Republicans say they'll never let the government be held hostage again, and Democrats say they'll never give in to political threats. Both positions sound principled, but when applied rigidly, they create gridlock. Still, there were moments of sincerity during the hearing. The speaker took time to praise 7 Senate Democrats and 1 independent who, in his words, put principle over politics by voting to move the process forward. That acknowledgement, even if politically strategic, mattered. It suggested that bipartisanship isn't completely dead. It's just buried under a mountain of distrust and partisanship. He also urged House Democrats to pray and do the right thing, a phrase that reveals both the moral and emotional fatigue that had set in. After 40 days of gridlock, you could sense that lawmakers were tired of fighting and eager to move on. Another important moment came when the discussion turned to the human cost of the shutdown, especially in air travel. The Transportation Secretary had reportedly described a dire situation. Overworked, unpaid air traffic controllers, widespread sick calls, and nearly half of all domestic flights delayed or canceled. It's one thing to talk about abstract economic impacts. It's another to confront the real-world consequences on people who make the system function every day. That human side often gets lost in Washington debates. Behind every government shutdown are people trying to pay rent, feed their kids, or just get to work. And when politicians talk about principle, it's worth remembering that principle doesn't pay the bills. Now, from my perspective, this hearing was both a relief and a warning. It was a relief because it signaled an end to a painful chapter. But it was also a warning because the same dynamics that caused this shutdown are still in place. Nothing fundamental has changed about how Washington operates. The incentives still reward division, not cooperation. If you look back over the last few decades, you'll notice that shutdowns have become more frequent and more politically charged. In the past, they were rare and short-lived. Now they're almost predictable. And that predictability is part of the problem. It normalizes dysfunction. In the hearing, when the speaker said, "Shutting down the government never produces anything, it never has if you study history," he wasn't wrong. But that statement applies to both sides. Each party has, at one point or another, used the threat of a shutdown to advance its goals. It's not a uniquely Republican or Democratic tactic. It's an American political habit that's gotten out of control. For ordinary Americans, the lesson here is simple. Political gridlock hurts real people. It's not an abstract debate. It's about paychecks, safety, and stability. The irony is that the very people who suffer most are often the least responsible for the conflict. let's also talk about the bigger picture, the politics behind the politics. Why did this shutdown last so long? In part, because both sides were calculating the political fallout. Each believed the public would blame the other. For weeks, polls showed a blame game tug-of-war, with Democrats holding a slight edge in public opinion. That gave them less incentive to compromise early on. Republicans, on the other hand, were banking on fatigue, that people would eventually get tired of the stalemate and demand Democrats give in. Neither strategy worked completely, and both sides walked away bruised. The Senate hearing showed that when the pain becomes too visible, when flights are delayed, when paychecks are missed, when the media starts focusing on individual stories of hardship, that's when political calculus changes. Politicians may ignore abstract numbers, but they can't ignore stories. They can't ignore images of TSA workers relying on food banks or air traffic controllers breaking down on live TV. So in a way, it wasn't the politicians who ended the shutdown. It was the pressure from ordinary people and the visible breakdown of daily life. That's a reminder of where real power lies, in the collective voice of citizens. Looking ahead, the real question is whether Congress learned anything from this. Will they create safeguards to prevent future shutdowns? Some have proposed automatic, continuing resolutions that keep the government funded even when budget negotiations stall. Others argue that removing the shutdown threat would also remove a key source of leverage for fiscal reform. There's truth to both sides of that argument. As a channel that values balanced discussion, I think it's fair to say both parties had valid concerns. Republicans are right to highlight the need for fiscal responsibility. Our national debt is massive and government programs should be scrutinized. But Democrats are right to insist that the well-being of federal workers and the public should never be collateral damage in a political fight. That's the tension at the heart of American politics. Principle versus pragmatism. And this hearing captured that perfectly. You had senators quoting history, invoking morality, and emphasizing the need to do the right thing. But behind every speech was a recognition that politics is also about power, who has it, who uses it, and who pays the price when it's abused. It's easy to watch these hearings and feel cynical. After all, the same speeches get made every time there's a crisis. But I think it's still worth paying attention because these moments reveal how leaders think when the pressure is on. The way they talk about the people they serve, whether with empathy or frustration, tells us a lot about their priorities. For instance, when the speaker urged lawmakers to pray and think carefully, it was more than rhetoric. It was an acknowledgement that politics isn't just about policy. It's about conscience. And in a time when public trust is near historic lows, that matters. Even symbolic gestures of humility can go a long way. At the same time, I think we as citizens have to demand more than just symbolic gestures. It's not enough to reopen the government and move on as if nothing happened. There should be accountability, not in a punitive sense, but in a reflective one. Lawmakers should have to explain what they learned from this and how they plan to prevent it from happening again. Another dimension worth discussing is media coverage. Throughout the shutdown, the narrative often focused on the political winners and losers. But what this hearing made clear is that there are no winners when the government stops functioning. There are only losers, the citizens, the workers, the families caught in the middle. Maybe if the media focused more on that and less on the scoreboard, the incentives would change. The hearing also revealed a shift in tone from the White House. The president reportedly told the press he wanted the government reopened as soon as possible. That was a noticeable change from the earlier weeks, when both sides were digging in. It suggests that even at the highest levels, there was recognition that the standoff had gone too far. When the speaker mentioned his conversation with the transportation secretary, describing the situation in air travel, it was a subtle reminder of how interconnected government is with everyday life. The planes we fly on, the food we eat, the veterans we care for, all of it depends on the smooth functioning of public institutions. When those institutions stop, it's not just Washington that suffers, it's all of us. Now, I want to take a moment to reflect on something deeper, the psychology of political standoffs. Why do politicians let things get this bad before taking action? Part of it is fear of appearing weak, fear of losing the base, fear of compromising on principle. But real leadership often requires doing the unpopular thing in the short term to achieve stability in the long term. That's what separates politics from governance. If there's one takeaway from this Senate hearing, it's that America is overdue for a cultural shift in how we approach politics. We need to stop treating governance like a zero-sum game and start treating it like a shared responsibility. That doesn't mean everyone has to agree. It means everyone has to care about the consequences of disagreement. To me, this hearing was a microcosm of the larger struggle between idealism and pragmatism. On one hand, you have politicians holding firm to their beliefs. On the other, you have the real-world fallout of that firmness. Somewhere in the middle lies the space where democracy actually functions. It's easy to say just compromise. But compromise without principle is weakness, and principle without compromise is chaos. The challenge is finding balance, and that's what our leaders are still struggling to do. As Congress moves forward, there's a lot of work to be done. The government may reopen temporarily, but the underlying issues, healthcare costs, budget priorities, trust between parties, remain unresolved. The next few months will show whether this was just a temporary truce or a genuine step toward stability. I hope it's the latter, because the American people deserve a government that functions, not one that uses dysfunction as a tactic. So as we wrap up this analysis, here's my final thought. Moments like this Senate hearing matter because they show us both the worst and best of American politics. The worst in the sense of how long it took to get here, but the best in the sense that even after all the division, there's still room for reason, reflection, and recovery. The speaker's closing words, asking his colleagues to think, to pray, and to act for the good of the people, were a reminder that public service, at its core, is supposed to be about service. Whether you agree with him or not, that sentiment deserves to be taken seriously. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about how this shutdown was handled? Do you think either side learned anything from it? And do you believe Congress should pass laws to prevent shutdowns in the future? Let's talk about it in the comments, but please keep it respectful. We can disagree without being disagreeable. If you found this breakdown helpful, please like the video, share it with a friend who follows politics, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can also support our work at patreon.com/45thperspective for as low as $5 a month. Every bit helps us continue to bring you thoughtful, fact-driven commentary without the noise. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay informed, stay engaged, and I'll see you in the next one.